Britain in the 1930s was not always a happy place to be. The country faced economic hardship. Many battled with unprecedented levels of poverty, and the policymakers of the day were preoccupied with one central and crucial question. Should Britain rearm her once mighty military ahead of what many believed would be a second Great War with Germany? Yet, despite this ongoing sense of foreboding, the months of 1936 were dominated by a question that seemed almost trivial. The newly installed king, Edward VIII, had fallen in love with the soon-to-be twice-divorced American Wallis Simpson, and he was determined to become husband number 3. In this debut season of our brand new podcast, we explore the abdication crisis, attempting to reconstruct events from available source material and solve the many mysteries that surround Britain's most recent royal revolution.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the first ever episode of Royal Revolutions. This is a new podcast from Royal History Geeks that looks at some of the pivotal moments that faced the English or British crown at any point in history. And we're kicking off with by spending the whole of the first season looking at what is perhaps the most recent royal revolution, the abdication of King Edward VIII in 1936. My name is Gareth Streeter, and I am a history writer and the founder of Royal History Geeks.
And I'm James Taylor, royal commentator.
And we are not going to talk to you very much about who we are or the background to this series or why we're doing it. The reason for that is because we have answered all that and more in a very fun and light-hearted collaboration with the wonderful Catherine Ibbotson from History After Dark fame. And we have recorded a special episode with Catherine where we talk all about the background of the series, why we're doing it, who we are, and the fun that we're intending to have. So wherever you got this current episode that you're listening to from, when you're finished, or if you want to pause and come back, check out that episode, which you'll also find there, and that'll give you a little bit of background. But for today, it's a case of on with the show, because we have got a lot to talk about. First of all, James, how are you?
I'm all right, thanks, Gareth. And how are you?
I'm very well. I'm really excited about doing this again. I know we're not talking about the background, but I primarily am a medievalist. Maybe I'm an early modernist. I don't know, but this isn't my normal era. So things I have loved is the plenty and abundance of source material, which is not something I normally get. And I've enjoyed going through all that very much. How are you feeling about today?
Well, I'm very excited too to be going through this. Although one thing I will say, you've just said about the abundance of source material. That's very true, but I think that very much like the medieval and early modern period, you still have to read a lot between the lines. You need to make your own judgments, and so I think that all of those skills are just as relevant here as they would be looking at any earlier period in history.
So I suppose, If this show has a star, the star is probably Edward VIII, from a constitutional position at least. He's the man that would become Edward Duke of Windsor. So should we start with him? You are a man that knows a lot more about the House of Windsor than I do. When was Edward VIII born? Who was he when he was born?
Okay, so he was born on the 23rd of June, 1894.
Okay.
And when he was born, he was Prince Edward of York, and he was third in line to the throne. His great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, was still reigning at that point, and ahead of him in the line of succession was his grandfather, the Prince of Wales, later to become Edward VII, and his father, the Duke of York, later to become George V. And he was actually
heir to the heir.
He is, and that's a position that we didn't see in this country until 2013, when Prince George was born as Prince George of Cambridge, as the eldest son of the Prince of Wales. And he was actually born at White Lodge in Richmond Park, which was the home of his maternal grandparents, the Duke and Duchess of Tex, the future Queen Mary's parents, Princess Mary Adelaide, and the Duke of Teck, and that's where he was baptized a few weeks later. And again, I found that quite interesting because several years in the future, there would have been an outcry when members of the royal family were baptized in the music room in Buckingham Palace after the private chapel had been bombed, rather than in a church or a cathedral.
Mm.
So the fact that it went back, as far as this did surprise me. I must say, I mean, I had read it, but until I looked at it again here, I'd not quite realised that was the case. And of course, his full name was Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David, and so that yes,
Just in case.
Just in case, yes. Well, of course, there's debate about why he was called Edward, because of course his grandfather was Albert Edward, became known as Edward VII. I've heard it said that he was named after his uncle who had died a couple of years previously, the Duke of Clarence, who, of course, his mother had been originally engaged to before she married his father. But, of course, although he was known as Prince Eddie, his name was, in fact, Albert Victor. So whether that was foremost in their minds when they were naming their child, I'm really not sure. Albert, of course, after the late Prince Consort. Christian after his great-grandfather, after Queen Alexandra's father, the King of Denmark.
Right.
And then the patron saints of England, also his father's name, George, Andrew for Scotland, Patrick for Ireland, and David for Wales. But of
It's
course,
quite funny, isn't it, that I mean, I guess they didn't know they were going to have 4 other sons.
no.
But they do start recycling the names with the others, don't they?
Well, they
Because they
do.
sort of
Yes,
use all of
exactly.
them with the first
Exactly.
child.
Exactly. Because, of course, his next brother was Prince Albert, even though, which is confusing because, of course, to history we know him as George VI, but
Yes.
his given name was
And
actually
he was,
Albert.
am I right? I think he was born on either the Prince Consort's birthday or death day, and the only
Yeah,
way of sort of consoling Victoria was to call him Albert.
it was the anniversary of his death on the 14th of December, and of course, it was also the anniversary of Princess Alice's death.
Right.
So, that was a pretty sacred day for the Queen, and so therefore, yes, they had asked her permission to call him Albert, and she had then replied with, "Well, he couldn't be known by any other name, being born on that day."
Very considerate of him to be born on that day, wasn't it?
I know, terrible, isn't it? But and also quite unusual that they should have chosen the name of each of the patron saints. I mean, one assumes that that's because they would have known or known as far as one can, hoped at least, that he would have been king one day of each of those 4 nations. So therefore, wanted him to bear those names. But indeed, he's I would like to just enter into a little bit of a discussion about George V and Queen Mary, or Duke and Duchess of York, later Prince and Princess of Wales, as parents, because I think there's been an awful lot written on that subject, and it's very difficult to be able to judge what they would have been like as parents, because you've just mentioned Albert, who later became Duke of York and later became George VI. He was born a year later. In 1897, their only daughter, Princess Mary, was born, followed by Prince Henry in 1900, who was later Duke of Gloucester, the father of the current Duke of Gloucester. And then after their grandfather had become king, George, later Duke of Kent, was born in 1902, and Prince John was born in 1905. So they did have 6 children in all. The majority of the time they spent at York Cottage on the Sandringham estate, which was certainly by royal standards a very small home. Was a cottage on the estate, which is now, I believe, used by estate staff. their grandparents, the Prince and Princess of Wales, later Edward VII and Queen Alexandra, lived in Sandringham House, and Queen Alexandra had furnished York Cottage before their marriage, and apparently it wasn't entirely to the Duchess of York's taste.
So it might be small by royal standards, but by cottage standards, it's pretty big from what I can
Oh,
see. Yeah,
indeed,
it's
it is.
they
It is.
weren't sort of sleeping two in a bed from the looks of it, kind of thing.
No, no, they weren't. But it had originally been known as the Bachelor's Cottage, and
Right.
was used as an overspill for guests who were staying at Sandringham House, who for men who were not married,
Hmm.
because the preference would be given to married couples to stay in Sandringham House. And you're right, by yours and my standards, well, mine anyway, it is very small, but when you compare it to the size of Sandringham House and
Yes,
to
yeah.
and because at that point as well in London they were living in York House, St James's, which again is fairly small, but is part of St James's Palace, and they went on to live in Marlborough House after uh, their father became Prince of Wales. It is relatively small, but apparently that's the place that the future George V was happiest in the world.
But their
But
family life, as you were saying, can I just check as well? Obviously, by the time we get to the abdication crisis, which I've been reading quite a lot about, the family are calling Edward David. Did that start from day one?
yes, yes, he was always known as David within the family, because that was the last of his given names.
Right.
Um, and yeah, so he was known as David. Albert was known as Bertie, like his
Hmm.
grandfather. Mary was known as Mary. George was Georgie. Henry was Harry, and John Johnny.
Which even it's interesting, isn't it, that to me, sort of having family nicknames, as most families do, is a sign of an affectionate
Mm,
family
mm,
unit,
yeah.
but that is not the impression we particularly get, although as you're saying, it's a debated and disputed impression of the Yorks as they were, the Waleses as they
Mm.
become, and George V and Queen Mary as they ultimately become.
Yeah, it's really difficult to judge, isn't it? Because history has very this view of them as being very cold, very uninterested in their children. And there probably is some basis for this as well, because when certainly after David or Edward was born, Queen Victoria's eldest daughter, the Princess Royal, Empress Frederick, Vicky, had written to her mother and said that May wasn't uh, Queen Mary was known as May in the family, wasn't an affectionate mother, wasn't necessarily, always running into the nursery and always wanting to hug and to play with the children. So, so while the future Queen Mary probably wasn't very different from most upper class women of her age, it probably was a little bit out of step with other members of the family. So that may be where that has come from. I don't know. But then in later life, Queen Mary was also to say that when their first child was born, that the future king, George V, was never out of the nursery, was always wanting to go, and that naughty little boy, he was always wanting to go and see him. So again, it's difficult to be able to judge on that one.
Certainly, it's fair to say that the Duke of Windsor, as Edward VIII will be later in life, certainly does seem to feel that his childhood was, I don't know, austere
Hmm.
or,
Hmm.
you know,
Lacking affection.
lacking affection. Yeah, yes.
Yeah. And I think that probably, if I were to draw a line on it and decide where I stand on that argument, I think that it probably was lacking affection, because Queen Mary was later to say, I always have to remember that their father is their king.
Mm,
She was also known to say that she would not argue with the king, because he was not, he had to remember, she had to remember that he was not only, but he was her king as well. However, he was known to be quite affectionate and Queen Mary only had to make a request, and usually he would grant it. So again, that's difficult to judge. But they also but he also did talk about how his father had been scared of his father, he'd been scared of his mother, and therefore he was going to make sure that his children were scared of
I'm
them.
sure that my children will be scared of me, wasn't
Yeah,
it? I
indeed.
was scared
Yeah.
of. I was. There's a lot of very brilliant George V quotes, and I'm never
Mm.
sure, but you will be more than I will, how many are apocryphal. Because obviously they're not. It's not like you get him caught on camera saying any of these things. They're
No,
always something someone else has
no.
heard him say.
Yeah, exactly. When it's something that he might have said, I don't know, at a shooting weekend or something like that, when he'd been with his close friends, that story would have been recounted to somebody else in society who,
Yeah.
might then have been picked up somewhere else. So, they're always second or third hand, aren't they? So the veracity of them is difficult to judge.
And also, my dad's the sort of person that would every now and then have had a little sort of moment of just feeling it's the sort of thing that a dad should say and make
Mm,
statements like
mm.
that. He did, but in front of people would have heard him. He wasn't like that at all. He
No,
was an incredibly, and still is, still alive, very affectionate
yeah,
father. But he would still occasionally make, statements like that
yeah.
because dad say stuff like that. He'd and
Certainly later,
yeah.
the Duke of Windsor was not very complimentary about his father
Hmm.
when he wrote about him and when he gave interviews later. But he was more so about his mother. Well, we say he was about his mother. He's also heard to say, wasn't he, that that all the women in the family had ice running through their veins. But he was also quoted as saying that when he was young, that they would go to their mother's boudoir and that they would have lovely, happy times with her each evening. That she would sing contemporary songs with them, like Camptown Races and things like that, and that she taught them how to embroider. And apparently, later during the First World War, because one of the issues of contention that he did have with his father, who was king by this time, was that he wasn't able to serve in the front line being the Prince of Wales. It was considered too dangerous for him to be, even though his brothers later went on to serve. But he apparently would sit doing his embroidery, petit point embroidery, in the back of the vehicles when they were going to inspect the troops in the line. And that was something that he'd learned from his mother. But it was something that he wanted to keep quiet because it wasn't seen as being quite masculine.
Of course, well, indeed. I mean, interestingly, it's very difficult, and I said we'll get on more to talk about this in subsequent episodes. It's very difficult to trust the Duke of Windsor's account, particularly of anything. Partly because, of course, he comes from it's all written, it's either all written or said in light of many later events. But I think it is reasonable to say that there seems to be some of what he says is corroborated by other sources. And interestingly, the Duchess of York, later Queen Elizabeth, we of course know her most famously as Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, who was a very big admirer of her father and Lord George V as a constitutional monarch and always reasonably close to her mother-in-law, Queen Mary. She has, in very private letters just between her and her husband, she is critical of what she understands her husband's upbringing to have been like, and is very keen to stress to her husband, "You must not be to our daughters like your father was to you."
Mm,
And because, I think she says none of your father's sons are a friend to him now as adults, and you must make sure that our girls want to be a friend to you when they're older, which of course they both absolutely did from everything
mm.
we know. So I think it's interesting that even her, as a broadly sympathetic insider, seems to have shared. She wasn't around at the time of their upbringing, of course, but she would have
No.
would have heard about it, which suggests that among the children there is a common narrative that they feel things weren't quite as they should have been, at
Mm.
least.
But of course, the other thing that you have to remember is that the future Queen Mother was from a family that was very close, very
Mm.
loving, very affectionate, which again might probably have been a little bit out of step with the
Yes.
aristocracy at the time.
Mm.
So again, looking at it through her lens, the royal family and their affections for each other would have been probably very, very different from
Mm,
the family dynamic that she would have had, that the Strathmores were known to have had.
mm, mm.
So again, I think it is difficult to judge. But if I had to, if I had to draw a line somewhere, I would say that they probably were George V and Queen Mary probably were lacking affection for their children. But that doesn't mean to say that they were cold or cold-hearted or unloving. But there was, of course, one particular incident in the childhood of their eldest two children that I do think does come across as quite concerning, because they had, as most upper class children would have been, even middle class children, they had live-in nannies and staff to look after them. One of their earliest nannies was found to be abusive to both the eldest children. We don't know her name, but it was found that when she left royal service, that she hadn't taken a single day off, um, and that has been interpreted as a sign of her as this unhealthy attitude that she had towards the children. And she was known to, when the children were taken to see their parents, and this is when they were toddlers, that she would pinch the future uh, David, future Prince of Wales, Edward VIII, Duke of Windsor. She would pinch him so that he would cry, and George V in particular would say, "Oh, take that crying child out of here," and Queen Mary was apparently not very much more affectionate. And but despite this, she lavished all her attention on him and very little on Prince Albert. And was it's also said that part of his problems with his digestion, because he went on to have duodenal ulcers, was caused at this time because of how she was feeding him, and she was not giving him any of the attention. It was all focused on his brother. He was neglected by her at that time, and so. But this went on for quite a while before it was actually discovered by their parents. And again, I found that difficult to be able to judge, because, on the one hand, if you trust somebody to look after your children, you're not necessarily looking for the signs. But the fact that that was going on in their house, I don't think says an awful lot for the amount of attention that they were paying.
So how about obviously his grandfather becomes Edward's grandfather, also Edward becomes king in 1901. His father then becomes king not too long after that. It's 1910, isn't it? Was it
1910, yes.
1910 that George V becomes king? How did all that and just the general getting older start to affect the young Prince Edward David to the family?
Well, he was known to be very close to his grandfather, with both his grandparents, in fact, because his parents did carry out quite long tours of the empire
Mm.
in both 1901 to 1902, and then again in 1905 and 1906. And so they spent an awful lot of time with their grandparents, and Queen Alexandra was known to be whisking them out of the schoolroom and taking them for romps and all of that sort of thing. So therefore, I think it's fair to say that they probably had a lot more affection for their grandparents. But his grandfather also did take him aside as a child. So by if you think by 1904 he would have been 10 years old. His grandfather would speak to him you know about being king one day. And of course, there's that quite famous photograph of them all in naval uniform, the three of them,
Yes.
3 generations, I believe at Cowes. Um, but then, of course, when his father becomes king, he's about 16 years old, and he's created Prince of Wales on his 16th birthday. in 1910, and he is he looks a lot younger. If you look at the pictures, he does look very young for his age.
He's always
Um,
underweight, wasn't he, throughout his whole life,
always,
I think.
yes, yes, he was, and was known to have this sort of. I don't like to use the word manic because that gives other connotations, but certainly a lot of energy and was always
Yeah.
exercising, running around. So that's fair to say. But he does look an awful lot younger because of that. And when you look at the pictures from the coronation in 1911, and also from him being invested as Prince of Wales at Carnarvon, which which was very much an invented ceremony from Lloyd George to have an investiture of a Prince of Wales at Carnarvon.
George V hadn't been invested as Prince of Wales, had he?
No, no, he
No.
hadn't.
So Edward VIII is the first investiture ceremony for the Prince of Wales since medieval. I mean, sort of not to go on about the book I wrote about Arthur Tudor, but he had an investiture ceremony as Prince of Wales. So it
Yeah.
was done way back then,
Mm,
in the 1480s in that case.
mm, mm.
But it wasn't. It's not been something that was consistently done throughout royal history at all, was it?
No, and did you really write a book about Arthur
I
Tudor?
know, I know. I don't mention it really, but
No, I mean that came as a shock to me.
mm,
Um, but no, you're right. And so his father was gazetted as Prince of Wales,
mm,
and they had been presented with well, he wasn't invested, but would have been
mm.
presented with certain insignia. Certainly, the Prince of Wales coronet, which he wore at his father's coronation, because obviously that is different and has one arch, as
Mm.
opposed to the four arches of the king's crown. But yes, it was, and I think it was very much the politics of the time. Lord George was prime minister and was Welsh himself, and it was seen as being. And also, you have to remember that this was against a backdrop of not particularly Welsh nationalism, but Irish nationalism, just before the First World War, and so I think that it was seen one as a tribute to Lloyd George's homeland, but
Right.
also it was seen as something to emphasize the links of the Union of the United
I
Kingdom as
see.
it was at that
I
point.
see.
And so, but he was horrified at the outfit that he was made to wear for the coronation, and for his investiture as Prince of Wales, because he wore garter robes, but he also had to wear knee breeches and he had to wear silk stockings. And this did not go down well with a very self-conscious 16-year-old. And
He was
as
never easy to work with, was he?
no,
The
no,
Duke of Windsor. He was always like he seems to have had this wanting to, and I can understand this in some ways, but he seemed to want to butt heads with his destiny pretty early on, and was
yes.
never one of those people that just sort of said, "Well, do you know what, this is just the way life's going to be. I may as well take the rough with the smooth and
Mm,
make the best of
mm.
it."
Well, he also seemed somebody that was never satisfied with what he had.
Mm,
He was unhappy with his childhood at home, perhaps with some reason, and longed to go away. Of course, in those days they weren't sent to boarding school, but he did go as a naval cadet
mm,
to Osborne, which of course had been he debatable whether he would have remembered it as his great grandmother's residence because he was so young when she died. But
yeah.
Osborne House, Edward VII never really liked, and so
Mm,
gave that to the nation. It became the naval base. So he went as a cadet to Osborne. Didn't like it there. Was very
mm,
unhappy. Felt that he was unfairly treated by some of the tutors, and certainly was felt that he was bullied by um, fellow cadets, and that led into his abhorrence for his costumes that he was made to wear for such royal occasions. But then he's then unhappy that he can't go on the front line in the First World War. He's unhappy with the restricted nature of the role that he then has as Prince of Wales.
mm,
He never seems to be satisfied with the role that he has
mm,
in life growing up. Um, and then, after after the First World War, he embarks on several very successful tours of the empire. It must be said that he certainly was very photogenic, and
Mm.
certainly, liked good photograph opportunities. I don't wish to make that sound insincere, but there are
Yeah.
certain pictures of him in because he went to Canada, and very famous pictures of him wearing all of the traditional headdress, that certain groups would be wearing in Canada,
Mm.
and also went to Australia, to other parts of the empire, and those and to Africa, and those tours were generally well received.
Mm.
And he was also known for did have quite an interest in social welfare, within the United Kingdom as well. But he also isn't particularly keen to settle down
Mm. Mm.
and to find a suitable wife, note suitable wife, and to have a family of his own. We see his siblings marry. We see Princess Mary marry in 1922, at which the future Queen Mother, Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, as she was then, was a bridesmaid. She went on to marry Prince Albert in 1923, and then there's quite a gap, but we see Prince George marry in 1934 to Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, and Prince Henry marry Lady Alice Montagu Douglas Scott in 1935. Of
John,
course,
of course,
Prince John.
the death of this, you're just going to say, John, of course, is sadly no longer.
Yes, John sadly died at the beginning of 1919, and that's where there was an incident that I think doesn't show Edward in the best
Mm.
light. It's very difficult to say again because the sources are not complete,
Mm.
but he was known to have said to one of his girlfriends that he was very little more than a savage, and that the family didn't see him. Um, but also he had written to his mother, and the letter doesn't survive. But a letter which he sent afterwards, apologizing for what he said that he was how insensitive he was,
Mm.
and that, of course, dearest Mamma, you loved him best as his mother, and no one can
Mm.
understand the pain that you've gone through. So that doesn't show him in a
No.
particularly good light, I
It,
don't
it
think.
could have been, it's difficult, isn't it? Because on the one hand, and this is where it's so intriguing, because you've got letter two, but not letter one.
Exactly.
And and we will all, with our own imaginations, fill what we think was in letter one. And it could have been, at the most extreme sense, something like, well, what do you care? You're a terrible mother anyway, and you never loved any of your children. Or it could have been something much more innocent where he tried to, and sometimes people do this when people die, but he tried to sort of cheer her up by saying, well, you've got to remember how hard his life was, so maybe now he's in a better place, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Look at, which is actually insensitive, but is meant probably
Yeah.
kindly.
And also, it could have been something along the lines of, oh, and remember, you've got five other children. Take
Yeah,
comfort in
yeah,
them.
yeah.
But my own thoughts on that are that it was probably, and again, I don't know, this is speculation on my part, but I think it was more that he was unhappy that his social life was being curtailed because of mourning for his brother.
It, it,
And so I think
yeah.
some of that may have spilt over.
All the oppression I get in this era, and from highly partial sources, is that we remember Edward as this very successful Prince of Wales because, if you like, he had the common touch.
Mm,
And he wasn't, necessarily, he was able to see beyond what the royal family should be doing and the limits of protocol and really connect directly with people and this great social conscience. It's interesting that a lot of the commentary I read, and frankly, I don't know if I have yet read enough to truly pass comment, but positions it as it wasn't so much actually that he connected well with people, it was that he connected very badly with everybody, including the people he had to work with as part of the establishment. And as a result, there were some things he did as part of that dysfunction within his own system that made it look like he was reaching out beyond it, and and connecting with people, and people liked it because they saw him acting differently. But that was almost a happy coincidence, and it's not that he had any real skill for what the common man or woman were thinking or anything like that. It's just they were almost able to spin his inability to function as a Prince of Wales should as a
Mm, mm.
positive.
I think that's probably true, and I think that there was that sort of slight nonchalance as well, which probably entered into some of that.
Yes, yes. And he is worrying his father sick at this stage, isn't he?
He is, as I said, he fails to settle down. He doesn't look as though he's going to look for either a suitable princess, although of course we have to remember that George V and Queen Mary were quite open to their children marrying members of the English nobility because they were quite, or Scottish nobility, because they were quite aware that after the First World War, one, foreign princes and princesses were hard to come by, but also that that was not likely to go down well at home. But he again doesn't seem to look um, for available women within the aristocracy. He
Just
only
quite the
seems,
opposite.
yes, exactly. He only seems to look for or be interested
Mm,
in married women. So the most famous of his um, relationships are there are two really significant ones. The
mm,
first is with Freda Dudley Ward,
mm,
who was his uh, companion, let's say, until around 1929. From about 1918 to 1929. It's difficult to give exact dates, but that's what we can understand. He was very close to her children, um, and it, and indeed her daughter was known to refer to him as the Little Prince. And after her death, there were several affectionate letters that he sent to her as a child that were auctioned. So you know you can get a sense of that relationship.
was Freda Dudley Ward older than Edward, or they were similar age?
They were similar age, I think. Yeah, both he and because the next relationship that he went on to have was with Thelma Furness,
Mm,
who was an American, again similar age to him, um, and she was married and had an estate at Melton Mowbray,
mm,
and he would stay there very often, and certainly because they met at a hunt in Leicester, I believe it was, because she was lived nearby. Um, and again, he was welcomed into that family circle. But their relationship was only for a few years. We can't be precise on
mm.
the exact ending, but we do know that that it was Thelma Furness that introduced him to
Indeed.
Wallis Simpson, because Wallis Simpson, a fellow American, was
Mm.
a guest at Thelma Furness's house for the weekend. Wallis writes about how she had a dreadful cold, and he was both sympathetic but also quite teasing of her. Um, and then Thelma Furness went away to stay with her
Mm.
sister, her twin sister, Gloria.
Should we, if we've got to the point where Edward and Wallis are meeting, should we go back in time and almost look at Wallis's life in
Indeed.
parallel? Because although I called Edward the star of the show, which constitutionally is correct, he's the significant figure, Wallis, perhaps from a popular culture and contemporary interest point of view, is the star of the show or the pantomime villain of the piece, I guess, depending on how people have looked at it.
Oh no, she isn't.
Oh, well, excellent, very good. Um, so Wallis, as we know, is American, and she was born on the 19th of June, 1896. So she's a very similar age to
Yeah.
the future Edward VIII, isn't she? And she was known, her name was actually Bessie Wallace Warfield. And she seems at some stage in her youth, the Bessie bit got it seems to have been Bessie Wallace all as one name at some stage, and that gets dropped at some
Mm.
stage. We don't particularly know why or when,
Wasn't
but probably
wasn't
just a
Bessie
dialect
after
thing.
her aunt?
Yes, it might have been, but it was prominent in her naming in the earliest mentions. It might just be a growing up thing, shrugging off that sort of named after identity, I suppose. I knew almost nothing about her early life or upbringing until we started doing this project. I still don't know a great deal about it, and I don't know how much there is to be known. But one thing that struck me, which I did realize, was she was from in Baltimore, where she was from. She was from an established sort of old money family. She wasn't, and I don't know a great deal about America in this period, but certainly from watching things like The Gilded Age, which I appreciate is not going to be a fully historically accurate source by any means. But you do realize I always sort of assumed that America, obviously not having a huge history in terms of society in the way that English society very much is the successor to the medieval court, um, and not having a title system. I hadn't realized till relatively recently. I'd always thought America was just all sort of new money, but actually they did have quite a strong old money, new money distinction, which was their sort of the old money being the aristocracy, those people that could trace themselves to the early families that came over from Europe, those families that had been involved in very old businesses, which would had a long-term pedigree. And Wallis is from that old money class, but she's she's a poor relation to it because her father himself was a younger son. I think he was the fourth son of his own father who'd had a military path. And his father actually dies when Wallis is very, very young, so as a baby, meaning that they are dependent, Wallis and her mother, on wealthy relations, which is, I think, it's fine. They were never going hungry. She gets a decent education paid for, but they're never in control of their own destiny. And they are, I suppose, a little bit like the Dashwoods in Sense and Sensibility. They're well connected, but then they're not financially independent. And there would have been a degree of hardship, which wasn't strictly speaking financial, but in terms of limited agency, I suspect that came with that. And I
Yeah.
thought that was interesting.
Well, it is, and it's very interesting that you should make that distinction because you know we we have always thought of Wallis as being unsuitable
Mm,
to marry the Prince of Wales, and I think that part of that is a class thing. It's not just the fact that
mm.
she was divorced, um, but of course you have to remember that you did have certainly at the end of the 19th century, Downton Abbey. I don't think is necessarily can be taken as being entirely historically accurate, but we do have that, but it does mirror the fact that you did have lots of peers who did marry American heiresses who came over.
Dollar
And so,
princesses.
yeah,
And they
yeah,
were of a lower social standing than Wallis. I think that's what's quite important to remember. They had the money because their fathers were normally captains of industry who had come up quite recently and were making absolutely huge sums of money in the railways and other
yeah,
sources around the world. And that's when you start to see America really start to gain the industrial edge as the world power. And they were looked down upon in their own countries because they were new money, and Wallis wasn't. But
yeah,
actually, which is one of the reasons those dollar princesses thought they'd do better on this side of the pond, because to our great lords and ladies, they were just all Americans, which was all a bit grubby anyway, sort of thing. So there was
yeah.
not really that distinction. But in Wallis's own
No,
world, she's from a slightly higher cut than these very, very, very wealthy heiresses.
yeah. So it probably would have been slightly beneath her to then have gone. Although she's probably about 20 years later than that happened anyway. But
Yes.
it would probably have been slightly beneath her to have gone, you know, launching herself onto a European marriage market.
And she had no money, so she had no
No,
real, and that's all the Europeans wanted, I think, from the Yanks, is they wanted the cash, and she had none of it. So probably her marriage prospects from that point of view were never particularly great
no,
anywhere.
no. And certainly her first marriage is not a happy one, is it?
There isn't, and what's also interesting to say is there's a hint of scandal with Wallis from a young age because there's two dates that are stated publicly as to when her parents got married,
Mm.
one by Wallis and one from another source. And that one from the other source, which is an administrative record which one might think is reliable, but you can never tell, suggests that Wallis was conceived out of wedlock.
Yeah.
Which might mean there was hints of scandal around her, which are obviously nothing to do with her whatsoever from a young age. But if so, that doesn't seem to have impeded her uh, in any meaningful or tangible way. And she does get married in 1916 to Earl Winfield Spencer and becomes Wallis Spencer. So she's Mrs. S from this point of view, but she's not
Yeah.
yet Mrs.
Not
Simpson.
not yet Simpson, and not to be confused with the Earls of Spencer.
I assume there's absolutely no connection between those two
No.
Spencer lines. But yes, it's interesting when these names crop up. What I found fascinating about this, because I always knew that Wallis had a husband before Ernest Simpson, I hadn't realized that it was the marriage was as long because it's always talked about as this sort of rather brief failed first marriage to this terrible chap, all of which seems to be true. But that
Mm.
brief marriage still lasts 12 years. And I
So
thought that was
not as brief
interesting.
as that.
No,
Although
exactly.
the length of the marriage isn't necessarily any indicator of how happy it might have been.
I don't think was ever happy. From every source that I've come across, he's an alcoholic. He's abusive when drinking, and she's somewhat at his mercy and wants the marriage to end from quite an early stage. What is fascinating is he's a military man. He gets posted to China. And in 1924, and basically Wallace's initial plan is that he'll go to China. She'll sort of stay behind and hope he never comes back. He gets to China. He says, I've mended my ways. You should come over. We should, give it another go. We're still married. Her family, I guess for understandable social reasons, are very keen for her to give it a go. So Wallis heads over to China in 1924 when she is 28. So not really a young woman anymore by the standards of the day. And with an initial objective of making a life for her there with her husband. And it is her year, it's only about a year she spends in China, that's going to end up being very significant in her life as a turning point.
Mm.
The problem is we don't quite know why it's significant. Everyone agrees it is, including Wallis, but we don't quite know why. Years later, when the abdication crisis is at its zenith, there is a tale going around London, and there's plenty of contemporary evidence that this tale existed, that Stanley Baldwin, who's the Prime Minister, had ordered a dossier to be compiled of all the scandalous things that Wallis got up to while in China, a year that she herself refers to as her lotus year. Um, and in it was full of all these terrible things of deviance that she got up to, about how she was having affairs with inappropriate fascist Italian ambassadors, how she was visiting brothels and learning sexual techniques that would help her entrap men and sort of keep them on a tight leash. And this is where the Wallis, the dominatrix, starts to emerge as a very clear narrative. And it is very clear that people like the Duke and Duchess of York, like Queen Mary, believe that this dossier exists, but but nobody has ever seen it.
No.
And I very kindly was sent a book by a publisher, by a chap called Paul French, about Wallis, called Her Lotus Year, which is about her time in China. And he argues, as indeed others have, that this dossier, which there's no record of, no one can find it, although arguably it could be held somewhere by the Secret Services and not have been ever put into an archive that people can access. No one's ever found it. No one, all the people who claimed they'd heard it existed, never actually claimed to see it or to have read it. They'd only claimed to have heard about it. And Paul French argues it just never existed, this dossier. And others argue there may have been something that existed, or Stanley Baldwin may have commissioned some project to try and unearth information on Wallis in order to sort of put the king off, kind of thing. But it didn't contain the sorts of things that it's later been purported to have done. Um, and it seems to me, I must say, my reading of Baldwin's actions in 1936 don't, I think, lend huge credibility that he was ever planning on trying to evade this crisis by discrediting Wallis. Wallis was already discredited in terms of her suitability, so I'm not sure it all holds together. And what French argues, and I found interesting and somewhat compelling, although I wouldn't consider myself really qualified enough to make a really firm call, is that the dossier never existed, and that Wallis, no way on God's earth, could have been getting up to things like visiting brothels while she was in China. He says he's demonstrated that the Italian ambassador, who she was supposed to have had an affair with, wasn't in China at the same time as her. So,
Right.
a lot of rumors. And he says that China was significant for Wallis, but it was significant because she came from Baltimore, where she had been, yes, socially, well-heeled, but provincial, and a poor relation of whatever circle she was part of anyway. She'd gone to China, still very imperially influenced part of the world, and she'd mixed with much higher members of the US establishment, much higher members of the British establishment. And it's where she convinced herself that she could flourish very well in that environment,
Mm.
and that she had an appetite for that kind of life, an aspiration for that kind of life, and the skills that one might need to do rather well at it. But she doesn't stay in China for very long, about a year. It's quite clear that her husband has not mended his ways. The drinking continues, the abuse continues. She comes back to the States, effectively leaving um, her husband, and they are officially divorced at the end of apparently, according to the dates I've been able to find, the 10th of December, which is of course a haunting date because that would later be the date of the abdication, but in 1927. And at some stage she then relocates to the UK, and she marries, so not very long after, in July 1928, she marries Ernest Simpson, who's an Englishman. He has access to higher circles. He's not nobility or anything like that, but he's got a reasonably respectable background because Wallis herself is American, and there are, as you've already said, James, quite a lot of wealthy Americans in English high society now. They start to move in circles. She becomes a friend of Lady, do we call her Lady Furness or Lady Furness? How do we say that? Do we know?
Um, well, I've always said Furness, but
I think you're probably right.
some, somebody else might correct me, but that's what I would say.
No, I think you're probably right. She meets the then Prince of Wales at this party at in Melton Mowbray in 1931, with her husband being present, and at some stage, probably a few years later, a romance begins. Probably when Thelma Furness is off to see family in the States and asks Wallis to look out for Edward, and that seems
Mm.
to be about the moment that the relationship becomes something more.
Mm. And she's not very well received by the royal family, though, is she?
Well, I'm trying to work out because from what I can see from the timeline, and obviously it's an affair, so it's not going to be hugely well
Mm.
documented. They're friends sort of throughout the early 1930s, and Lady Furness is apparently feeling that she's worried the Prince of Wales is going to get bored.
Yes.
So she's trying to introduce lots of fun, exciting people that he seems to like into her circle. He obviously likes Wallis and Ernest, not that they actually don't seem to have come across as particularly engaging, witty people. Um, but I don't think the Prince of Wales necessarily was either, so wouldn't have been looking for that. And then she's brought in because Edward likes her, not necessarily romantically at this stage, but then perhaps Lady Furness later feels she brought him too close. I did want to reflect on something actually, which having sort of briefly studied Wallis in the run up to this, has changed my opinion of both of her and of the Duke of Windsor to some extent, because having only sort of known the abdication crisis, I wouldn't say superficially, but reading about it as chapters in other books and stuff like that, I always sort of assumed that Wallis Simpson was this almost like Anne Boleyn figure who was controversial, seductive, but also brilliant and
Mm.
captivating
Mm.
and witty and a real star of the show that couldn't be contained by any kind of convention or anything like that. And that in a sense, Edward and Wallis, for all their faults, at least had this sort of star quality that you could never take away from them. And maybe were two stars that could never be contained by the trappings of royal life. And it was interesting doing this, and I recognize that both primary and secondary sources are all biased. But Wallis doesn't actually seem to have been this great wit or conversationalist or sparking intellect or particularly amusing or humorous person. Um, she just seems to be quite ordinary. And
Mm.
Edward is not a great towering intellect who necessarily needs that in someone. She seems to have had this thing he loved, which she was happy to put him down, both in
Yeah.
public and in private, which he seems to have um, really latched onto. But she isn't actually this Anne Boleyn figure either in terms of her ability or I think in terms of her ambition. And I found that fascinating.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because that's often how she's been presented, that she's been presented as the money grabber, as
Mm.
as that she was looking for the title, that she wanted only ever to be queen. And I think that the evidence probably points towards the contrary.
Well, this is what's fascinating. Um, so I would say she probably was a money grabber. She did want fun. She never had any particularly, and an there is an avariciousness, if that's the word, to her. And what's quite interesting is when the relationship starts to become more prominent. Um, well, quite early on, actually, in 1934 itself, Wallis seems to have been followed by being observed by Special Branch,
Hmm.
Secret Services, in a nutshell, who seem to think she's having an affair with a chap called Guy Trundle at the same time as having an affair with the Prince of Wales. And there are other sources that indicate that might not be true, but either way. And basically the suspicion that the authorities have at this stage is they don't seem to be worried about Wallis leaving Ernest and marrying the Prince of Wales and that being really inappropriate. I mean, as if that would ever have been allowed to happen in the lifetime of George V anyway.
Hmm. Hmm.
They seem to be worried that Ernest and Wallis are basically in it together, which to an extent they were. This was never the wool never seems to have been pulled over Ernest's eyes in any ways, and they were both using it to try and fleece the prince,
Hmm.
basically,
Yeah.
and to get money. And now the Secret Services are making it more sinister by saying Wallis is then using this money to attract younger men.
Yeah.
The Prince of Wales is basically funding her sexual exploits. Um,
Right.
but I think it's interesting. So I think there is an avarice there.
Hmm.
But what's fascinating, we'll probably talk about this more in future episodes. She seems entirely naive as to the
Yes.
constitutional setup of the UK. She
Yes.
seems to believe, and I think she probably gets this from Edward, but she seems to believe that that once he's king, he's got the same levels of power as the US president.
Yes.
And therefore, if he wants to marry her, of course she'll be able to. She'll get divorced and there'll be no fuss and she'll be queen. And she quite likes the idea of it. But if she had anything like the level of drama it was going to cause and any idea of that, well,
Mm.
it was certainly not worth that. She certainly didn't want it to that extent by any means. And frankly, in that setting, she'd probably rather stay with her husband than go off with Edward
Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah.
And that seems incredibly naive, but of course she wasn't from these shores.
No.
And she may have been fed a false impression by her new lover, the Prince of Wales.
Yes, indeed. You've mentioned the lifetime of George V.
Yes.
What we have to remember is that by 1935, when George V celebrates his Silver Jubilee, he is 70 years old and his health is failing. So, how would that have played into her feelings then, do you think?
Well, I don't know, and it's a good question because it seems to me, and you're better qualified in this era than I am. It seems to me that George George V's health was failing. He had very prominent health cares
Mm.
in 1935. They thought he was going to die, but then he seemed to rally a little bit, perhaps.
Mm.
And when he did die in 36, it was not quite expected that he would quite die then. I can't, you'll know whether that's true or
Yeah,
not,
yeah,
but whether, I mean, I'm never quite clear because it's very unclear from the sources exactly how aware and at what stage the king and queen became of Wallis Simpson. They were
mm,
certainly aware, and George V does raise it with the Prince of Wales,
yes,
and obviously not approvingly. But Edward does arrange for Wallis and her husband to be presented to them at court. I
yes.
don't, and that's early. That's I think in 1934.
Mm.
But I'm
And,
not
and there,
sure. Sorry, go on.
there was certainly at the Jubilee Ball in 1935.
That's what I meant. Yes, it wasn't. You're right. It was 35, not 34. But she was presented at court, as many people would have been presented to them. It's not clear to me whether at that stage they understood who was being presented to them or not.
No, and it's difficult to be able to judge whether they knew quite how significant that was going to be. One thing that I do think is quite telling is that in 1935, at the time of the Silver Jubilee, there was a portrait painted of the King and Queen attending the Thanksgiving service at St Paul's Cathedral with the other members of the royal family. So, and the Prince of Wales is the only one who's looking out at the artist. But you've got the Yorks and Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret, and you've got Duke Duchess of Kent on there. And so, looking at that, you would be lulled into quite a false sense of security that everything was, that the king and queen were celebrating their 25 years on the throne. Yes, they're both quite elderly, and it was known that the king was pretty ill, because he'd had a very serious health scare in 1928 to 29, and was out of action for several months, and he'd never really recovered his strength, although he was still making regular public appearances. So I think that even though people would have known that he was quite ill, that the sense of crisis wouldn't have been seen. And even though the Prince of Wales is as yet unmarried, he's not that young. I mean, he's now 41, but he is still young enough to marry and
Hmm.
to have a family of his own. But of course, because you see the Yorks there as well, that's they are seen as the supporting act, but also that the continuation of the line is there should the Prince of Wales
Yes.
not then have any children of his own. Um,
Which
and it,
supposedly, sorry to
yeah,
interrupt you, is what George V, again, one of these possibly apocryphal sayings, I don't
yes,
know,
yes.
around the whole, I pray that my
Mm,
eldest son will never
mm.
marry and have children, so nothing will come in the way between Bertie, Lilibet, and the throne.
Indeed, and also that I think there's also another adjunct, depending on which
Mm,
version you read, that the boy will ruin himself within a year.
yeah.
I'm always a little bit skeptical because that just seems that little bit too convenient. It seems to have been written in hindsight, but
Mm,
who knows? He may have said that, and certainly um, to an extent that George V was ever close to any of his children was closer to the Yorks. And I think that was the influence of the Duchess of York. You know, you talked
yes.
about that earlier. So yes, there was he certainly was closer to them and to their family than he was to the Prince of Wales. But as
Long term
1935,
as well.
yes, yes, and as 1935 draws to a close, it becomes obvious that the king's health is failing because his sister Princess Victoria dies in November. He cancels the state opening of
Mm,
Parliament. The Duke of Gloucester is due to marry. Prince Henry is due to marry in 1935. His fiance's father, the Duke of Buccleuch, dies very shortly before the wedding. And ordinarily, the wedding would have been postponed. There was a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey, like his siblings had been planned. But rather than postpone the wedding, they have a private service in the chapel at Buckingham Palace. And that's because they realise that the king's health is failing. And therefore, it's a case of if you don't marry now, you might not be able to. Certainly not during the king's lifetime, but also you couldn't have a wedding during court mourning. And so the as the royal family go to Sandringham for Christmas that year, the king makes his Christmas broadcast on Christmas Day at 3 o'clock to the Empire. And if you hear it, you can hear a certain weakness in his voice. And of course, he then goes on to die in January 1936.
which is going to be quite a big game changer for what we are talking about on the next few episodes,
Indeed.
because no longer do we have a wayward prince with a woman he is dalliancing with. We have a king who is the constitutional centre of the country, and whoever he is dealing with is a matter of state affairs. Um, we will talk about that later. But I wonder if just by later, I mean, we will talk about that in another episode. But I one final reflection, I suppose, I would have on what we've talked about from Edward and Wallis's relationship, Wallis and Edward, WE or we, they sort of refer to themselves in letters, is I can imagine at this stage that while people were concerned, they had seen Edward be reasonably publicly, by publicly I mean within society, linked to two married women previously, both of whom, and apparently reports of particularly him with Freda Dudley Ward as a
Mm.
younger man show him completely obsessed with
Mm.
her in a way he
And
would later be
and
with Wallis.
you say within society, but I mean there were pictures quite openly taken and published of them.
Right.
Not necessarily intimate pictures, but pictures of them
Yeah.
at the same events together.
Yes.
I don't think there was any real attempt to hide the fact that they were close friends. I mean, probably not the fact that they were in a romantic relationship probably wasn't reported, but there was no
Mm.
real attempt to hide the fact that they were both attending the same events
Yes.
in society. They were photographed together quite openly
Mm.
and quite regularly. There
And
was no real attempt to
and
disguise that, at least.
and despite all of that, he had moved on from her and he'd gone
Mm.
to Thelma Furness. And again, he'd moved on from her. So there must have been hope that eventually Wallis would be one that he would move on from.
Mm.
And
Mm.
Wallis may well have believed that too, which could be partly why her and her husband were trying to maximize the the revenue, if you like, that they got from him. And it should be said that he was showering Wallis with all kinds of expensive gifts, using Duchy of Cornwall money, which really is not what that money's there for, um, to do that. And there must have been hope. Okay, well, not to worry. If the king lives another 5 years, by the time Edward gets to the throne, he'll have moved on.
Yes.
And he might have someone else equally unsuitable, but he will have moved on from Wallis. So, of course, George V dying when they seem to be at the peak of their affair is going to be hitting everybody as the worst possible timings. And I think that is something we can pick up again next episode.
Indeed.
Right. Well, let's leave it there for then. What I just want to say quickly is that the very last episode of this series on the abdication crisis, which we think at the moment will be episode 7, but it's not impossible that the more episodes may be added in
episode
as we go.
127.
Yeah, quite. Is going to be all questions. So if you have questions for us to answer, get in touch with us. You can either drop us an email at, I'll put a slide and a voiceover of that slide at the end of this episode, which has got all of the contact details of where you can get in touch with us. But do get in touch with us, and we will go through all the questions we receive and do our best to answer them. But until then, we will see you next week when the next episode drops. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Royal Revolutions is a Royal History Geeks podcast. For more information about our other podcasts, head to royalhistorygeeks.com/podcasts. The Royal History Geeks community is active across Facebook, X, YouTube, Instagram, and Discord. Just search for Royal History Geeks on your social platform of choice, and you should find us there. The first episode of Royal Revolutions dropped in December 2024. The entire first season will focus on the abdication crisis. Toward the end of season 1, we will devote an entire episode to questions, so please get in touch with us via our socials or at royalhistorygeeks@gmail.com to send any questions about the abdication crisis our way.